we are.
And congressional leaders are scheduled to meet at the White House later today. We're going to take you live now to the U.S. Senate as they are about to resume. Senators are considering an extension of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA. In about 45 minutes, we're expecting a vote on an amendment to the FISA bill, then a vote on final passage. The House passed the FISA extension in September, and if the Senate passes the bill without amendment, it heads to the President for his signature. After the final passage vote on FISA, the Senate is expected to move to a $60 billion spending bill for Hurricane Sandy victims. We're expecting up to 21 amendments on that bill. Now, live coverage of the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Almighty God, before whom the generations rise and pass away, watch over America and use our senators to keep it strong and good. Imprint upon their hearts such reverence for you that they will be ashamed and afraid to offend you. Remind them that their thoughts, words, and deeds are under divine scrutiny. Bless the many others who work faithfully on Capitol Hill and whose labors bring dignity and efficiency to the legislative process. We pray in your sacred name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., December 28, 2012. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Mark R. Warner, a senator from the Commonwealth of Virginia, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President pro tempore.
Mr. President.
The senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, following leader remarks, the Senate will begin consideration of H.R. 5949, the FISA reauthorization bill. At approximately 9:45 a.m. this morning, there will be several, up to 25, roll call votes in order to complete action on the FISA bill and on the Supplemental Appropriations bill. The Senate will recess from 12:30 p.m. until 2:15 p.m. to allow for caucus meetings, and additional votes in relation to executive nominations are possible today.
Under previous order, leadership time is reserved, and the Senate will proceed to the consideration of H.R. 5949, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 510, H.R. 5949, an act to extend the FISA Amendments Act of 2008 for 5 years.
Under the previous order, Senator from Oregon.
I'd ask unanimous consent to vacate the quorum call. Well, we're not in a quorum call. President, I ask unanimous consent to call up my amendment, which is at the desk.
Without objection. Clerk will report the amendment.
The Senator from Oregon, Mr. Wyden, for himself and others, proposes an amendment numbered 3439. At the end, add the following. Section 5, report on the impact of the FISA Amendments Act of 2000.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent be considered as read.
Without objection. So ordered. Under the previous order, there will be 30 minutes of debate equally divided prior to the vote on the relation to the Wyden amendment.
Mr. President, given the events of yesterday, this is the last opportunity for the next 5 years for the Congress to exercise a modest measure of real oversight over this intelligence surveillance law. Here's why. Colleagues, it is not real oversight when the United States Congress cannot get a yes or no answer to the question of whether an estimate currently exists as to whether law-abiding Americans have had their phone calls and emails swept up under the FISA law. That is the case today. Colleagues, it is not real oversight when the Congress cannot get a yes or no answer to the question of whether wholly domestic communications between law-abiding Americans in this country have been warrantlessly intercepted under the law. That is the case today. Colleagues, it is not real oversight when National Security Agency leadership states in a public forum that the agency does not keep dossiers on millions of Americans, and yet they will not give the Congress a yes or no answer as to whether the agency collects any sort of data on millions of Americans. That is not the case today. So, Mr. President, what this amendment does is it gives us the opportunity to do real oversight by getting yes or no answers to questions that have been asked repeatedly by members of the Intelligence Committee. The amendment, in order to ensure that national security is protected at an important time in our country's history, gives the President of the United States unfettered discretion to redact any information that he believes is necessary in order to protect the country's national security. And the amendment does not require any agency to do new work. We've heard cited repeatedly that it would be impossible to do an estimate and projections that have been discussed in the past. So we have changed course and we have said all we are seeking here is a yes or no answer to the question of whether an estimate has actually been done. Mr. President, this is an important time for American security. It will always be an important time for American security. It is also an important time for American liberty. And this amendment ensures that we can strike the appropriate balance between protecting our country's well-being and also protecting the individual liberties that we all cherish. Mr. President, I would reserve the balance of my time at this point.
Mr. President,
Senator from California.
I rise in opposition to the amendment. This amendment would require the Director of National Intelligence to issue a public report within 90 days assessing the impact of the FISA amendment program and its surveillance authorities on the privacy of U.S. persons. Now, that sounds benign, but it is not. The goal of this amendment is to make public information about a very effective intelligence collection program that is currently classified. All of the material All of the information has already been made available to the Senate Intelligence and Judiciary Committees. All they have to do is read it. It's hundreds of pages of material. Senator Wyden has raised a number of issues that all concern the potential for surveillance conducted pursuant to authorities to result in incidental collection. Section 702 authorizes the executive branch to go to the FISA court, that's a federal court, of federal district judges appointed by the Chief Justice and obtain annual approval for certifications of the Attorney General and the DNI that identify categories of foreign targets. These are what I call a program warrant to conduct surveillance on non-U.S. persons. In other words, people who are not United States citizens or lawful permanent residents who are located outside of the United States. Now, it is possible that there can be some incidental collection of communications who are U.S. persons, a target calling a United States person. This potential for incidental collection does not mean that the intelligence community is intentionally conducting surveillance on U.S. persons. In fact, doing so would be a violation of law. Here's the key point to understand about incidental collection. Although the government may, under the right circumstances, be authorized to retain the communication between known terrorist and presumptive U.S. person or persons, including the phone number he relayed to the terrorist, the government cannot place the United States number on surveillance and start collecting the calls to and fro the U.S. number without first obtaining a court order or a warrant. To do so would be to target a United States person, which I'll explain is reverse targeting. Can the government use Section 702 to target a U.S. person? This is important, and the answer is no. The law specifically prevents direct collection against U.S. persons. This prohibition is codified in 702B, which states that the section may not be used, and I quote, to intentionally target any person known at the time of acquisition to be located in the United States, or to intentionally target a United States person reasonably believed to be located inside the United States. Is there a loophole or backdoor that allows the government to use 702 to target U.S. persons by searching incidental collection? Answer, no. The Department of Justice, the DNI's office, the FBI, and the NSA have all advised that limiting the ability of intelligence analysts to review and analyze information already in the government's possession under 702 would make these agencies less able to respond quickly during a developing terrorist plot. In sum, review of the information already collected enables the government to protect against a terrorist attack on this nation. As of October 7, 2011, the Congressional Intelligence and Judiciary Committees received over 500 pages of information from the Department of Justice that specifically related to matters covered by this amendment. The Senate Intelligence Committee held a closed hearing in October. The senior senator from Oregon attended. These were the issues specifically discussed. In December of 2012, the Congressional Intelligence and Judiciary Committees received in excess of another 100 pages of material relating. We held another closed hearing, which the senator attended, where these issues were discussed. The Inspectors General for the intelligence community and NSA have both provided classified and unclassified responses to letters written by the senator from Oregon and the senator from Colorado explaining why it is not feasible to estimate the number of people inside the United States who have had their their communications collected or reviewed under these authorities. And finally, the DNI sent a letter. Now, here's the point. If you want to talk about oversight, all of this is there. And it's effectively the Intelligence Committee of the United States Senate to do its oversight and go in and read the materials. I feel very, very strongly that what this aims to do is make public a program that should not be made public at this time. Make public names and numbers of names, which should not be made public at this time. So I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. Finally, I would like to place in the record a letter from General Alexander, the head of the National Security Agency, which essentially explains remarks that he made and a letter that he wrote to the senator from Oregon, which explains those remarks. I thank the chair, and I'd like to yield the floor to the vice chairman for the remainder of my time. Thank you.
Senator from Georgia.
Mr. President, I oppose Senator Wyden's amendment also because it imposes an unreasonably burdensome reporting requirement on the DNI and is inconsistent with the purpose of FISA, which is to obtain foreign intelligence information. This amendment would require the diversion of scarce intelligence community personnel and resources away from the identification of foreign intelligence information, but rather to assess whether any wholly domestic communications have been inadvertently collected under FAA authorities. This is an unnecessarily and pointless exercise. The collection system was designed to comply with FISA's clear prohibition against the intentional collection of wholly domestic communications. And let me just read to you how specific this is in the law. This is directly out of Section 702, which the amendment seeks to attack. There are limitations against collection of information under the following guises: an acquisition authorized under subsection A, which is to collect information from those located outside the United States. We may not intentionally target any person known at the time of acquisition to be located inside the United States. May not intentionally target a person reasonably believed to be located outside the United States if the purpose of such acquisition is to target a particular known person reasonably believed to be in the United States. May not intentionally target a United States person reasonably believed to be located outside the United States. And it goes further into detail and is very specific about the fact that there is no authorization to target United States persons. As the chairman said, it's our duty as members of the Intelligence Committee to do the oversight required to make sure that these laws are complied with, and we do that. We do it in a very deliberate and a very direct way by not only having the individuals responsible for the collection of this information made available to the committee, but all the way to the top. The individuals who collect it, as well as the leaders of the intelligence community, come in once a year, and they'll come more often than that if there's a problem that we need to address, and we review this information. Senator from Oregon, the distinguished presiding officer, members of the Intelligence Committee, you know the type of oversight that's available to us. So if there's any question about what is done and whether Section 702 is not being complied with, we have the opportunity to ask the questions. The amendment by the distinguished senator from Oregon actually goes further than what he said was a simple yes or no question, and requires that the intelligence community go into great detail on any estimate or any finding where a United States person may have been involved. And is that really the type of information that we need for our intelligence community to spend their time on versus trying to find bad guys around the world? I think the answer is pretty simple. It's not abused. If there is a problem, as we talked about yesterday, the problem is addressed by the intelligence community, by the intelligence committees on both the House and Senate side. If there is a problem, we fix it. There are minimization procedures that are in place that address this issue, that are used when necessary. And I would just say that if we do our job, then there's absolutely no reason for this amendment, and we do our job. The chairman is very diligent in making sure that the annual reviews are set at specific times of the year. Every member of the committee has an obligation to be there at the hearings to ask the tough and the right questions. And as far as I know, every member of the committee has done that. And we have provided the right kind of oversight. So I would encourage my colleagues to vote against this because it simply is an unnecessary amendment, and it is the last amendment we have to consider, and I simply would say, as we said over and over yesterday, we've got to get this bill on the desk of the President by December 31. That's, 3 days away now. So it's important that we conclude this morning, that the bill be sent to the President's desk so we can sign it, so we can continue to provide the right kind of supervised collection against foreign individuals to make sure that America and Americans are protected. And with that, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Colorado.
Mr. President, I rise in support of the Wyden amendment. Before I share my thoughts on the amendment, I wanted to express my respect and admiration for the chairwoman and the vice chairman of the Intelligence Committee. They're professionals, they're easy to work with, and they have the security of our people centered at all times. As a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, I've learned a great deal about our post-9/11 surveillance laws and how they've been implemented. And in the course of my 2 years on the committee, I've determined that I believe that there are reforms that need to be made to the FISA Amendments Act before we renew this important law. Earlier this year, Senator Wyden and I opposed the bill reported out of the Senate Intelligence Committee extending the expiration date of the FISA Amendments Act because we believe that the Congress does not have an adequate understanding of the effect that this law has had on the privacy of law-abiding American citizens. In our view, it's important for members of Congress and the public to have a better understanding of the foreign intelligence surveillance conducted under the FAA so that Congress can consider whether the law should be modified rather than simply extended without changes. That's the simple purpose of the amendment that Senator Wyden and I and other colleagues have filed to make more information available for members of Congress and the public so that they have a better understanding of the law and its implementation. This amendment requires the Director of National Intelligence to provide information to Congress about the effects of the FISA Amendments Act on the privacy of Americans, something that we all hold dear. It would require information on whether an estimation has been conducted of how many U.S. communications have been collected under the FISA Amendments Act, and if so, how many, whether wholly domestic communications have been collected, and whether officials have gone through these communications to conduct warrantless searches for the phone calls and emails of specific Americans. It would not require the intelligence community to conduct any new estimates of Americans whose communications may have been collected under the statute, and would give the President full discretion to redact information from the public version of the report. Colleagues, I'll conclude by restating my belief that the American people need a better understanding of how the FISA Amendments Act, Section 702 in particular, has affected the privacy of Americans. I also believe we need new protections against potential warrantless searches for Americans' communications. And I believe, Mr. President, without such reforms, Congress should not simply extend the law for 5 years. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, let me just thank my colleague from Colorado. He has been a wonderful partner in this effort to strike a balance between security and liberty, and I look forward to working with him in the days ahead. Mr. President, how much time remains on each side?
Proponents have 8 minutes and the opponents have 2 minutes.
Mr. President, let me begin, and I say this with the greatest respect to the distinguished chair of the committee who I've worked with cooperatively on so many issues, that when she said that this amendment seeks to publish names, I would just like to say that's simply factually incorrect. In no way, shape, or form does this amendment seek to publish names. And I want to tell colleagues that if anyone were in connection with this program to seek to publish names, I would vigorously oppose that effort. So I simply just want to make sure the record reflects that. Now, we've heard by the opponents of this amendment that the intelligence community has already provided the Congress with lots of information about the FISA Amendments Act. The reality, however, is a lot more complicated than that. Much of that information is in highly classified documents that are difficult for most members to review. And the reality is most members literally have no staff that are cleared to read the documents that have been cited here. So the fact is most members of Congress don't have staff to help them deal with these complicated issues. So they're, in many particulars, in the dark about the program. And certainly the 300 million plus Americans who expect us to strike that balance between security and liberty also are in the dark. Now, Mr. President, I've already noted that the amendment gives the executive branch unfettered authority to make redactions, and I just want to make sure every senator hears the exact language, because I think this is as broad a redaction proposal as I've seen in my service on the committee. The redaction proposal states, if the President believes that public disclosure of the report required by this section could cause significant harm to national security, the President may redact such information from the report made available to the public. So I hope colleagues who have asked about whether this would endanger our country, particularly at a dangerous time, now they've heard here on the floor of the Senate that somehow this amendment would seek to name names. I hope they will see, one, that that's not the case, and number two, that the President, as outlined on page 6, has full and unfettered discretion to redact the report as he sees fit. Mr. President, I also want to respond to this point that there would be no time for this to be considered by the other body if we add this modest measure of oversight. The other body will be meeting on Sunday, as I understand from the news reporting this morning. So they will be here this weekend. The House, the other body, is perfectly capable of passing an amended bill, getting it to the President by the end of the month. The distinguished Vice Chair and I both served in the other body. We know that when they're here, particularly on something that just involves a report, it would be very easy for the other body to pass this and send it to the President. The House, in fact, passed the extension a few months ago with over 300 votes. So passing it Sunday when the other body is in session seems to me to not exactly be a difficult and arduous task. What it comes down to, Mr. President, is what you define robust congressional oversight over a program like this to be. And I would say, again, respectfully, that to me, without basic information as to whether an estimate even exists, in response to colleagues, again, this is not talking about anybody going out and doing a lot of work. This is a question of either responding affirmatively or negatively to the question that Senator Udall and I have been asking lo these several years. does an estimate exist as to whether or not law-abiding Americans have had their communications swept up under this law? And there's a reason to be concerned about this, because Senator Udall and I have worked very hard to get at least a little bit of information on this, and we have been able to declassify that there has been a Fourth Amendment violation in the past. I believe without this information that Senator Udall and I have sought, that is behind this amendment, those who say that there ought to be robust congressional oversight of this program ought to reflect on the fact that without this information, which is so essential to do our work, oversight is not robust, it's toothless. It's toothless if you cannot get an answer to the question as to whether or not an estimate exists as to how many Americans have had their communications swept up. I'll close, Mr. President, with this. This is, as the distinguished chair of the committee said earlier, a critically important time for American security. Those of us who serve on the community, the distinguished president of the Senate hears these briefings. We go into that room and the doors are locked, and you certainly get significant information about the threats to the well-being of this country. So it is an important time for American security. It is also an important time for American liberty. And to paraphrase Ben Franklin, as I did yesterday, those who give up their liberty in order to have security, as Ben Franklin said, really don't deserve either. The two are not mutually exclusive, Mr. President. We can do both. That's what the constitutional teeter-totter has always been about. Security and the well-being of our country here, protecting our liberties over here. What Senator Udall and I contend this morning is that without access to information about critical questions, such as whether an estimate even exists as to how many law-abiding Americans have had their communications swept up under FISA, we can't answer the question as to whether the constitutional teeter-totter is in balance. So I hope my colleagues will vote for this amendment. Given the events of yesterday, colleagues, this will be the last opportunity for 5 years to exercise some modest measure of real oversight over this program. I hope my colleagues on a bipartisan basis will support this amendment. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President, I believe we have, how many minutes?
2.5 minutes.
2.5, just 1 minute. The fact of the matter is we do an intelligence authorization bill every year. If there's a need for change, we can change. So this isn't the last opportunity to affect any change for 5 years. It is the last opportunity to see that this bill, that this section continues on without interruption. I also want to point out that one of the areas where the administration has really made an effort is to put people, whether it's the DNI, whether it's the Department of Justice, to come to the Hill and explain to individual members how this works. With respect to the classified materials, any member has access to it. Any member can go up and read this material. The staffs of the Intelligence Committee can read this material. The Intelligence Committee can read this material. As chairman, I'm happy. If someone comes up with an irregularity, I'm happy to look at it, to have a hearing on it. But to change this at this time has my very strong opposition. I would urge a no vote, and I'd like to yield to the Vice Chairman.
Well, Mr. President, I would just echo what the Chairman has said, that the very well-trained, dedicated staff of the Intelligence Committee is available to assist any member to review the classified information that is the subject of Section 702. That's why they're there. The Senator from Oregon is right. Every member of Congress doesn't have that highly trained, top-secret staff member, and there are reasons for that. There are reasons why the Intelligence Committee members do have those types of staffers, and those staffers are available at any time for discussion of this issue, or for that matter, any other issue relative to national security that's within the purview of the Intelligence Committee. So I again say that this amendment is simply totally unnecessary because there are specific and direct prohibitions in the law as well as in court decisions that do not allow our respective intelligence community agencies to listen in or review emails or whatever on U.S. citizens unless it's under some sort of court order where probable cause must be shown. And we need to make sure that we're equipping our intelligence community agents with every single tool necessary to combat terrorists around the world. This section is critical to doing that. I urge a vote against the amendment.
Senator from California. Is there sufficient second? There's to be. On the previous order, the question occurs on the amendment number 3430 offered by Senator Wyden from Oregon. Yeas and nays have been ordered. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. DeMint. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson, South Dakota. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Bingaman, Franken, Klobuchar, Nelson of Nebraska, Sanders, Schatz, Udall of Colorado, and Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Burr, Chambliss, Coburn, Feinstein, Isaacson, Johanns, and Lugar. Mr. Begich, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Whitehouse. No. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu. Aye. Mrs. Murray, Mrs. Murray. Aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson of Florida? No. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts? No. Mr. Coons? Aye. Mr. Warner? No. Mr. Menendez? Aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico? Aye. Ms. Cantwell? Aye. Mr. Leahy? Aye. Mr. Conrad? Aye. Mr. Tester, Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Coates, Mr. Coates, no. Mr. Crapo, Mr. Crapo, no. Mrs. Hagan, Mrs. Hagan, no. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Ms. Ayotte, no. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Corker, no. Mr. Roberts, no. Ms. Mikulski, no. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Brown of Ohio, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Akaka, aye. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Johnson, South Dakota, no. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Hatch, no. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Enzi, no. Mr. Pryor, no. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Vitter, no. Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cornyn? No. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Cardin? Aye. Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inhofe? No. Mr. Kyle, Mr. Kyle? No. Mr. Levin, Mr. Levin? Aye. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Bozeman? No. Mr. McCain? Mr. McCain? No. Mr. Schumer? Ms. Murkowski, Ms. Murkowski? Aye. Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lieberman? No. Mr. Harkin, Mr. Harkin? Aye. Mr. Portman, Mr. Portman? No. Mr. Paul? Mr. Paul? Aye. Mr. Alexander? Mr. Alexander? No. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole? No. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mr. Thune? Mr. Thune? No. Mr. Schumer? Mr. Schumer? No. Mr. Sessions, Mr. Sessions? No. Mr. Rubio, Mr. Rubio? No. Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bennett? Aye. Mrs. Shaheen, Mrs. Shaheen? Aye. Ms. Snow? Ms. Snow? No.
I know.
Mr. Toomey, Mr. Toomey? Aye. Mrs. Hutchison, Mrs. Hutchison? No. Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wicker? No. Mr. Risch, Mr. Risch? No. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran? No. Mr. Merkley? Mr. Merkley? Aye. Mr. Grassley? Mr. Grassley? Aye. Mr. Kerry? Mr. Kerry? No. Mr. Rockefeller? Mr. Rockefeller? No. Mr. Carper? Mr. Carper? Aye. Mr. Cochran? Mr. Cochran? No. Mr. Webb? Mr. Webb? Aye.
there any senators wishing to vote or to change their vote? On this vote, the yeas are 43, the nays are 52. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to. Under the previous order, the clerk will read the bill for a third time.